Right, hello everyone. My name is Zach Sturgeon, KK4RDD. I'm teaching a little tech class on over Hangouts on Air. By the end of this, you should be able to go and test for your amateur license. It's a pretty fun hobby. It's a pretty simple test. It's only 35 questions, taken in about there's technically no time limit, but pretty easy to get into the hobby this way. That's how I started. First, I'd like to thank the Roanoke Valley Amateur Radio Club for providing these slides for me, which I have brought up to speed with the latest quiz pool. The question pool has changed as of this past month. Let's go ahead and get started. Yes, that's not important. So the question pools are separated into 10 sub-elements. We should be able to cover at least 1 and 2 today, perhaps 3. We'll see how we do on time. So go ahead and get started. The first section, sub-element rather, T1, deals with the amateur radio service and rules and regulations. And I've got a ding. Why do I have a ding? You're gone away. And where did you go? Here you are. All right. So, first off, the purpose of amateur radio, as far as the FCC is concerned, is for advancing the skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. That answer rather has changed since the last question pool. It used to be someone who didn't have a pecuniary interest in broadcast radio. The agency that deals with radio communication and regulating it in the United States is the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And there are several parts of the FCC rules which govern certain services. The one we're concerned about is Part 97. It's the one that governs amateur radio operators. There are other parts as well. Part 15 is for unlicensed low power operation. Part 90 is commercial, and so on and so forth. So in dealing with interference, interference is any transmission which will interfere with or degrade a legitimately licensed radio communication service. And this question really gets me. Number 5. Not sure where in Part 97 this comes out of, but apparently a purpose of the amateur radio service rules and regulations is for enhancing international goodwill, so you can feel good about yourself while you're enjoying your hobby. So while we're talking about interference, there is only one case and one case only in which additional radio services are protected from interference by amateur operators, and that is radio navigation service. It's still used as a backup to long distance air travel for navigating ships as well, and that's a service which immediately relates to safety of life and must be protected from interference at under all circumstances. Another term you'll need to know is telemetry. Part 97 defines telemetry as a one-way transmission of measurements at a distance from the measuring instrument. So in the case of for example, a repeater which might run on battery power, it might send telemetry about the state of charge of the battery. Similarly, check my levels here. Similarly, a weather station might send its telemetry wirelessly, and many do. We'll talk about that later. There's a type of radio transmission called APRS, Automatic Packet Repeating System, and there are several weather stations connected via APRS, which report weather conditions from sensors to eventually be gated over the internet and collected that way. We'll also need to know about frequency coordinators. Frequency coordinator recommends transmit and receive channels and band plans for repeater stations depending on where they're located. Since everyone has to share the spectrum we're allocated under Part 97, we have to do our best to share it and prevent intentional interference. And amateur operators in a local area or regional area that are eligible to be auxiliary or repeater stations select a frequency coordinator. So essentially, it's an elected position. Hang on. All right, the definition of a radio station, or an amateur radio station, or a radio shack, a ham shack, if you will, is the apparatus necessary for carrying on a radio communication. It could be a base station, it could be a mobile station, it could be installed in a vehicle of some sort, or handheld. And at no time is willful interference permitted to another amateur radio station. In some cases, parts of the amateur radio spectrum are shared between other users, in which case it's allocated either on a primary or a secondary basis. So in those cases, allocated on a primary basis, you'd have right of way, if you will. However, it's both parties' responsibility to resolve interference. And one of the ways you can use amateur radio service is conducting radio experiments. If you think we know everything there is to know about radio technology, we're kind of in the beginning stages, believe it or not. There's still plenty of research and physics to be explored there. Let's move on. All right, so let's talk about telecommand. A telecommand station, according to Part 97, or telecommand transmission, is a one-way transmission to initiate, modify, or terminate functions of a device at a distance. So an example of this, opposed to telemetry, which is transmitting either repeatedly or not necessarily all the time, but it is instead of just sending signals, it can also listen for them. An example of telecommand would be turning on an amateur radio satellite. There are a few orbiting satellites carrying amateur radio. We refer to those as Oscars. There's a few Oscars which orbit, and they have a repeater on board. And to control the functions of that satellite, we use telecommand. You can also use it to, for example, with our telemetry device, we could use it to change settings, and that would fall under the definition of a telecommand. In the case of a repeater, which we'll discuss in just a minute, we could perform actions on the repeater which change its configuration, such as turning on or off a PL tone, which is a way to help eliminate interference. And in the case of particular bands, the 23 centimeter band, if you are just happen to be on it, it is shared with. There are services outside the United States where the 23 centimeter band is not allocated to amateur radio, and it is used for radio location. In that case, amateur radio is allocated on a secondary basis, and you must take active steps to eliminate harmful interference. This is a lot of this is all the regulatory crud in section T1. It's just something you have to know to be able to pass the exam. So we'll try to grudge through this. So what is the ITU? The ITU, International Telecommunications Union. It's an agency created by the United Nations for dealing with information and communications issues. It's kind of the global FCC, if you will. And the ITU has 3 regions defined for how radio allocations get dealt out. It's important to note that some U.S. territories might have different amateur radio allocations because they are not in ITU Region 2. North America is in Region 2. That should be one of the questions, if I'm not mistaken. So you'll need to know that. We might have touched on this during the introduction last week. Since we're dealing with radio waves, which is a type of wave, we can refer to the properties of the wave either by frequency or wavelength. And frequency is related by for any sort of wave is the velocity of the wave equals wavelength times frequency. So wavelength and frequency are inversely proportional. If the velocity is constant, in the case of a radio waves always travel the speed of light, at least in a vacuum. So we'll generally always presume it's in a vacuum. And so it's pretty simple. Just 300 divided by the frequency will you'll end up with the wavelength, and vice versa. So that'll be important to know. There are several questions dealing with. It'll ask you which of the following frequencies is within the 6 meters bands, and it looks like I've got some text issues in there. I'll have to go back and fix that. So applying that formula, we can 6 meter band is roughly about 50 megahertz. So it's 6 equals excuse me, 6 equals 300 over 50. There we go, 300 over 50 megahertz would get us a wavelength of 6 meters. Where aren't you going? There you are. Oops. And in the case of the 2-meter band, well, 146.52 megahertz, this is one of the questions. That's actually an important frequency. It's the national simplex frequency. We'll talk about simplex operation in a few minutes. And I think I can read the rest of this. It's not going to fix it for me. 443.350 megahertz is in the 70 centimeter band. Technician class licensees have full privileges on 6 meters and up. So, or I guess 6 meters and less, but higher in frequency, which you are allowed to use in ITU Region 2. If you are located in an area near Canada, however, there are restrictions on the 70 centimeter band because it is allocated differently there. There's a lot of commercial devices in that wavelength. Same thing here. Basic. The question will give you something like, which of the following are you authorized to operate on a 23 centimeter frequency, or in the 23 centimeter band? It's just a basic issue of knowing. You don't have to memorize the frequency ranges for the exam, but just know the equation to go between wavelength and frequency. In the case of the 1.25 meter band, there is a gap on the slide. It's kind of unmuted. There is a gap in the 1.25 meter band. And question 8 there, as I mentioned before, the B8, since amateur radio is sometimes secondary, allocated on a secondary basis in some portions of the bands, you can find non-amateur stations, and the correct course of action would be to avoid interference. All right, moving on. So we know that we get certain frequency ranges which we are allocated to operate on as an amateur radio operator. It's important that you do not operate on the edge of a band or on the edge of a different band. For example, on the 1.25 meter, it's from 219 to 220 megahertz is digital modes, but being on the edge there can present problems. For example, a signal, depending on its modulation, will extend beyond the frequency which you're transmitting on. And sometimes the frequency that you think you're on and the frequency that you're actually transmitting on can be different, either because of calibration issues or because of frequency drift. Frequency oscillators, variable frequency oscillators, can be affected by a number of things like voltage and temperature. So as a transceiver or as a transmitter heats up, the the frequency tends to drift. And in the case of 6 meters, 2 meters, 220, and the 220 band above 30 megahertz, this is true for all classes above 6 meters. There are certain parts of the band which are restricted as far as which mode you can use. We'll talk about mode in a minute. And these mode restricted bands are usually always the first 100 kilohertz or so of the VHF bands. So in the case of 6 meters, it's from 50.0 to 50.1 is CW only, Morse code only. And 11 here in the same thing from in 2 meters, 144 megahertz to 141, which is right at the bottom of the 2 meter amateur allocations. Those are restricted to Morse code only, CW only. And number 12, it's important to note that because amateur stations might be operating from a ship, for example, maritime mobile, the allocations are not the same everywhere in the world, because you might be crossing over into a different ITU region in international waters. And I had showed this. This is the 1.25 meter or 220 megahertz allocations we saw earlier. They have mode restricted subbands where the bottom 1 megahertz of the 220 band is restricted to digital modes only. Whereas the rest of the band you can use digital data anywhere. You can use voice and image as well, and you'll probably end up printing something like this out. This is a band plan. A band plan is voluntary, and we'll demonstrate where you should operate in. In this case, this is a bit of both. This has both regulatory, for example, the red sections of 2 meters and 6 meters. Those are CW only. We'll talk about band plans more. So after you've taken your test, every amateur radio operator is assigned a call sign. You might be familiar with a few call signs from listening to commercial radio or watching television, WTOP and WAMU. Those are all call signs. Call signs are used to identify stations uniquely, and we can tell by looking at a call sign where that operator is based, roughly. And there's a certain format to how call signs are structured that you'll have to understand. All US stations begin with the prefix of either A, K as in kilo, N as in November, or W as in whiskey, and are followed by a number. You can also have I believe also double letter, so K4 and KK4 are both valid prefixes. And that example it gave there, W3ABC, is an example of a valid one. You can also have the FCC grant a call sign specifically for a special event. Special event call signs are generally shorter, which have both just one letter in the prefix and the suffix. So, example, W3A would be a special event call sign. They're generally granted for very short periods of time. And the number is significant. It tells us where in the US that call sign originates, assuming it's a valid US call sign. For example, I'm region 4 in Virginia up here. So depending on where you are, will determine what call sign you'll end up with. So what kind of things are allowed over amateur radio? It's any communications incidental to the purpose of ham radio and remarks of a personal character. So generally, it can be a soapbox, but that's not the primary purpose. You can communicate with amateur operators from all over the world as long as they are licensed in their country and the foreign country does not object to such communication. You're also allowed, if you travel abroad, to operate in a foreign country only when the foreign country authorizes it. It's usually part of you'd have to register with the government there. There's things called de-expeditions. It's kind of part of the hobby is trying to get into your logbooks at least one station from every country. And some countries, due to restrictions on who can get an amateur radio license, it can be difficult to get those contacts. So people from Europe and abroad will travel to that country in a de-expedition and set up stations there, be granted a temporary call sign to operate there. And if you're the kind of person who likes a vanity number plate, vanity license plate, there is a vanity system for amateur radio call signs. Otherwise, call signs are allocated sequentially. And let's see. In the case of operating maritime mobile, you can transmit from any vessel or craft operating in international waters, which is registered in the United States. Generally, if you are operating on a craft, you are allowed to do so as long as you get permission from the vessel's captain. I've had a few conversations with people on small aircraft like Cessnas over Simplex FM. That was pretty interesting. In that case, they'd have to get permission from whoever the pilot was if they weren't the pilot already. So when you go in and take your exam, it'll be graded right there. It will be vetted by 3 volunteer examiners who will all grade it. And you will receive this certificate of successful completion of examination. Big words. CSCE. You will get this certificate. It'll take 2 weeks or so. You'll be able to start transmitting as a technician class if that's the test you passed. As soon as your call sign is granted, the license is good for 10 years, and you get a 2-year grace period to renew the license. And in extreme cases, you can have your license revoked or suspended if the FCC notices that any letters they're sending to your home address are not what they have on record. So it's important to upon moving to keep your address and information in the FCC database up to date. There have been people who have had fines handed down because they forgot to provide a good mailing address. And there we are. Like I mentioned, you have a grace period of 2 years, and you are able to operate as soon as your station license appears in the FCC database on your certificate. If you search the same name as in the FCC's universal licensing system, as soon as your call sign shows up, which usually takes about 1 or 2 weeks, then you are able to get on the air, and then the FCC will mail you a paper license as well. There's also a grace period. If you until you renew your license after the 10 years, you are not technically allowed to operate. It's pretty simple. As far as the vanity call sign system, any licensed amateur is eligible to select a vanity license. And the FCC offers 3 levels of license classes: technician, general, and amateur extra. We're just going to be covering technician, but if you want, you can study for the 2, for general or amateur extra. It's a lot of work, but if you really wanted to, you can walk in and take your technician, take your general, take your amateur extra, and presuming you pass all 3, you can go from 0 to extra in just one testing session. I've seen it done, but it takes quite a bit of studying. And in the case of clubs, clubs can be issued their own call signs, but only the person who is the trustee of the club, the person who actually was technically granted the license, can select a vanity call sign. Pretty straightforward there. Like I mentioned earlier, you are able to talk with amateurs all around the world, except for those which have notified the ITU that it doesn't want that. Those are very rare, but a few of those countries do include places like North Korea, for example. In some cases, you are legally allowed to communicate with military stations during something called the Armed Forces Day Communications Test. I forget exactly when it is, but you get QSL cards and everything. It's pretty fun. And you are allowed to generally, encryption is not allowed on the air. You're not allowed to encrypt except when controlling a space station or satellite, for example, because satellites are expensive and they need to be protected from hooligans with pirate transmitters and who might, inadvertently bring down a multi-million-dollar satellite because of an error. So encryption is allowed in those cases. It's also allowed for telecommand of RC craft. Uh, RC RC transmitters are usually 50 megahertz is a common RC frequency. And if you're in the hobby and you've ever been to days where RC field days where there's a dozen different transmitters all going at the same time. Unlicensed, there's only 10 channels in the 50 megahertz band, but 50 megahertz is also part of the 6-meter ham radio band. So with your technician license, you're allowed to use up to 1 watt on with 10 extra channels on 50 megahertz. So don't have to worry about your RC helicopter crashing because someone's garage door opener is off frequency. And you can get some pretty good range in the 440 band. There's some amateur radio operators who use 440 to 440 megahertz to operate RC craft, and you can get ranges with 30 to 50 kilometers and above. Generally, you're not allowed to transmit background music or music as the primary station content. So I'm sorry, if you wanted to be a radio DJ, you're going to have to do it somewhere else. Amateur radio is used for two-way communication. The only time music is allowed is in the case of rebroadcasting manned spacecraft communications. The International Space Station has a few amateur radio operators as well as amateur radio gear on board. So it is possible to, when it makes a pass, you can communicate with someone from space. It's pretty cool. There's also a packet radio, so you can, even if they're busy and doing other things, you can leave messages and they get downloaded from other passes. I've also believed they've installed a fast scan television, so you can have a look at a live video feed. It's pretty cool. And so in those cases, they make an exception because astronauts' jobs are stressful as it is. So they'll let them listen to music. Let's see. I didn't mean to bring that up. And generally, you're not allowed to conduct business over ham radio. Again, it's for those without a commercial interest. But you are allowed to do limited things in dealing with sale and trade. For example, you could tell someone over a repeater that you have some equipment for sale, as long as you don't always do it, and that the equipment you're selling does in fact pertain to the hobby. And generally, you're no cursing. 80 meters might beg to differ, but indecent and obscene language is not allowed, so I'll leave that to your devices to interpret. The only other word you're not allowed to say is Mayday. Mayday is reserved to indicate distress. And generally, in a real Mayday call, you'd be saying it 3 times. You can talk about Mayday calls over the air, but that's why you say it 3 times to make sure they're really at risk. And you are allowed to retransmit radio signals of other stations when they are from certain classifications of transmissions, which are auxiliary transmissions, repeaters, and space stations. So what is a repeater? A repeater is something used to retransmit a signal usually in real time. So generally repeaters have very good coverage compared to just operating on one frequency. The way it works is you have one radio receiver listening on a certain frequency. In this case, 146.385 in our example here. So you would transmit on 146.385. The repeater would pick it up. It would usually be in a location that has good elevation, good line of sight to the transmitter. And it will rebroadcast that 600 kilohertz up the spectrum. We refer to the offset by where the input frequency is compared to the output frequency of a repeater, and it'll rebroadcast that usually with a decent amount of power. And I use repeaters almost daily to conduct conversations all the way from here to Winchester, even up into Maryland. And the repeater I've used, we've even gotten some contacts from Pennsylvania, so it's a decent amount of range. These are what repeaters look like on the back end. It's probably hard to see, but basically it's made of two radios, one to listen on the input frequency and one to transmit on the output. And because of a nuance of radio physics, radios don't like to have, since the transmitter is, even though it's on a different frequency, it's a very close frequency. So we have to use some clever filtering to make sure that the rebroadcasted signal doesn't interfere with the signal it's trying to hear. And generally, like in this case, I'd say I'm not allowed to really charge for teaching these things. But if I were a school teacher, for example, I could teach what I'm teaching on the school's time, and that's allowed. Generally, otherwise, we try to keep money out of the commercial out of the amateur radio. You are allowed to transmit signals relating to broadcasting or for example, a news organization, a local news organization, generally wouldn't be allowed to use an amateur radio operator to handle program production. That would be commercial fare. The exception is when it's a case dealing with the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. It's very rare that ever happens. But in that case, it would be a signal of distress. When we talk about broadcasting, so some people use broadcasting and transmitting interchangeably, but the FCC definition of broadcasting is a transmission intended for reception by the general public. And generally, all your transmissions you will want to identify. There are rules for how often you have to identify. The exception is piloting a remote control craft. In that case, you just write your call sign on the transmitter. And the only other exception to continuous broadcasting is in cases of practicing Morse code, information bulletins, or emergency communications, particularly dealing with amateur radio. For example, WA1W broadcasts there's a schedule. If you want to learn Morse code, you can tune up the code practice part of the band, and they transmit bulletins at different speeds. So it's a good way to practice. So we use a term called control operator. If you are sitting at a station, an amateur radio station, and you are the one transmitting, and you hold the license, you are both the control operator and the control point. But for example, if I wanted my sister, who is unlicensed, if I wanted to let her use my radio, and I am physically present, she can talk over it, in which case I am still the control operator, and I have to make sure what she's transmitting complies with Part 97. Is Part 97 kosher? And E2, we're almost through this. Only a person for whom an amateur radio operator or primary station license grant, which is the call sign in particular, who is authorized for alien reciprocal operation may, this is worded poorly, may be designated a control operator. Let me find this question. So, better wording. Only someone who has an amateur radio license which appears in the FCC database or is authorized to operate their license outside of the country can be the control operator. So in the case of, normally, if you are the only one involved, you are always the control operator, and only the person with the license, with the station licensee, may designate a control operator. The class of operator license held by the control operator determines the transmitting privileges. So if you're borrowing someone else's station who's already set up, you're transmitting with your license class. In the case of things like field day, you are allowed to, I think it might actually mention this, eventually, you're allowed to, for example, as a tech, use the general portion of the band if there is a general control operator present and you use their call sign. The location at which the control operator function is performed is called the control point. It's essentially the place where you turn your radio on and off, or change frequencies, or change output power, for example. In some cases, that might not be the same place where you're transmitting the audio. I'd mentioned APRS earlier. APRS is pretty neat. It's a network of types of repeaters which are designed specifically to repeat data transmissions. And in those cases, digipeaters operate under automatic control because they don't have excuse me. The operations of a digipeater are governed by autonomously by a small computer, or it can be programmed. Let me pull this up. You can hear APRS transmissions. It looks like there's a net going on right now. Yeah, we might be able to hear that eventually. But one of the applications of APRS, it's sometimes incorrectly backronymed as Automatic Position Reporting System, but it is Automatic Packet Repeating System. This is sort of the internet for amateur radio. Incidentally, part of the protocol specifically is meant for reporting position via GPS. What we're looking at right here, the green line is a ship or a boat of some sort with an APRS station on it, reporting its position. It broadcasts it. It gets picked up by a digipeater. And the digipeater can relay it onto something called an iGate, or internet gate, and then that gets slurped up on a few websites and stored in a database. In the case of control operators, the station licensee and the control operator are both equally responsible for operation of the station when the control operator is not the station licensee. So effectively, if you as the station licensee nominate someone else to be your station's control operator, you're both responsible. This is the case when a club, for example, has a repeater and the control operator is not the person who the licensee is, or the station license is granted to. Repeaters, same as digipeaters, are under automatic control. There's generally not a person at the repeater site. Also, the repeater operations are governed by a computer or some sort of programming. And then we use telecommand and telemetry to change settings on the repeater, if possible. If you are physically at the station, at the control point, you can unplug the radio. It is referred to as local control. And operating the station over the internet is an example of remote control. There's a system called Echolink, which once you have a tech license class, you'll be able to get an account for. It's a really easy way to actually get into amateur radio. It's the cheapest way I can think of to get on the air. And the way it works is it uses voice over IP connected to amateur radio transceivers, usually on 2 meters or 70 centimeters. And some of the Echolink nodes, as they're called, connect to RF repeaters. So you can transmit, for example, I can talk over a repeater in Northwest California, even though I'm all the way in Virginia. I transmit over my computer, and then the audio gets gated out by this Echolink node. You might have heard that. The FCC presumes that the person with the license grant is always the control operator, unless you document it. So if someone else who has a license operates your station, it's a good idea to make a log of it. And at no time may a technician class license be the control operator of a station running in the extra class segment of the amateur bands. Extra class being the highest license class. There are certain frequencies which are dedicated to that are exclusive to extra class. There's a portion that generals have that tech does not. So it's a good incentive to upgrade. And you don't always have to use your call sign. And I'm not sure why these images are all skewed. I'll have to fix that. You are allowed to, for example, if you're lending amateur radio communications to a marathon, we can, instead of calling whoever's running the marathon net WA4TSC, we can use a tactical call sign and call it race headquarters. And we can use anything as a tactical call sign, as long as it doesn't sound like a different call sign. For example, there needs to be a distinction. And in the case when you're using a tactical call, you still have to follow FCC requirements for identification, which is every 10 minutes during a transmission. You have to put out the FCC licensed call sign. You're also required to use at least every 10 minutes. Generally, to start a contact, you will end up using a call sign. And finally, you're required to use to identify with your call sign at the end of a conversation. Whenever we talk about voice transmissions, we call it phone. The only acceptable way in the US to identify over phone is either in English or by CW or Morse code. We call it continuous wave, CW, Morse code. And you're required to do so every 10 minutes and at the beginning and end. Pretty easy to follow. You are allowed to self-assign indicators when identifying. In some cases, for APRS, for example, you might have multiple APRS nodes which all have to use your call sign, but to tell them apart, you can tack a number on the end. That's how APRS does it. But you can also do so with other, like repeaters, for example. And the acceptable way to do that is with a slash or a stroke. Slant is a way of saying that. So in this case, it'd be Kilo Lima 7 Charlie Charlie stroke Whiskey 3, or slant Whiskey 3 is an appropriate way to read that. A non-licensed person is allowed to speak with a foreign station, someone outside the US, using a station under the control of a technician class operator, if the foreign station is one with which the US has a third-party agreement. And that just goes back to you're allowed to talk with anyone who hasn't objected normally. But in the case of tech class, we need a third-party agreement, which most stations on the air do. But it's something to watch out for. Uh, if you go and upgrade your license, you can upgrade your license at any time. If you already have a call sign, for example, tech class, as soon as you've completed your general exam or amateur extra exam, and you pass and you get the certificate of successful completion, you're allowed to use those privileges right away, but you have to identify with a suffix on your call sign. There used to be more license classes than just tech, general, and amateur extra. There was novice as well. So people who already have a call sign who upgraded to tech would use their call sign and then slant Kilo Tango, which indicates that they have technician privileges. Same thing with general, slant Alpha Golf indicates that you are a tech who just upgraded to general. And you only have to do this until the new license grant appears in the FCC database. It's pretty easy to look up. And we talked about repeaters earlier. It's a type of amateur station that simultaneously retransmits something it's receiving on a different channel or several different channels. Not sure why that's in there twice. The control operator of the originating station, is accountable if the repeater retransmits something that violates FCC rules. So, for example, if someone hops on a repeater that you set up and does something like jamming or something contrary to Part 97, you're not directly responsible because you're just retransmitting that. You are not technically the control operator. The person who's the originating station is responsible. And you're allowed to pass messages. You are allowed to retransmit third-party communications from foreign stations if the governments allow it. Most of the cases this is fine. This applies particularly to things like Echolink, where since it's voice over IP, it might be anyone. You can use repeaters in the UK, in Germany, all across Europe. There's Echolink nodes, which you can use from here with your technician class license. It's all available to you as long as the governments permit it. Anyone can set up a club as long as there's at least four members, and you can make it official by getting a club call sign from the FCC. And you'll want to keep station records generally. You're not required to keep any records in particular. Most stations log contacts just to have. For some people, it's part of the hobby, and sometimes it's used in things such as competitions. But you want to keep your license, your FCC license, for example, available in case the FCC comes knocking, which you hope is never the case. And I think that's it for T1. Do we have any questions? If you've got a question, you can submit it via the Q&A app. I see one here. Is there a site where I could get the info you have on the home screen right now? I don't see why not. I should be able to publish these slides. I haven't gone through them completely, and updated them. I think all of T1 is good. So, for example, this is what one of the questions looked like. But as far as let me select that. As far as the information I have here, I will provide links to these slideshows that you can look at. I'll also have a link to the question pool. The question pool is something like 400 questions. So in the course of this class, we're going to be covering all 400, some odd. And the exam, the actual exam, is only 35 questions, which is randomly drawn from that pool. There's also a test generator. There's a few test generators which are rather good. I'll provide links to that as well. And you'll be able to, in addition to studying these questions, you'll be able to try it out and see how you'd score if you took the test right now. So let's go and cover. We're going to cover T2 as well. I'll leave the questions here to you to look at. Let me pull up T2. And set this up here. Oops. Do we have no other questions? All right, we'll go ahead and start.
I'd hate
All
to
right.
interrupt, but,
Yeah, go ahead.
actually, the ask a question button is not actually showing up for me.
You don't have a Q&A button?
No, I have it on the side panel, but nothing indicating that I can add a question is actually showing.
That's interesting. Someone submitted one. I just answered it. Maybe it's just with the YouTube link. I think that's what it is. It's only with the YouTube link. People in the actual Hangout can't use the Q&A. It's really silly. So in that case, if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me, or put it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so you unmuted. Okay, so I'm muting you again. FYI. There we go. All right, so T2 covers operating procedures. Honestly, that last segment was probably the most bureaucratic section of the entire pool. So it's probably really boring to sit through, but it is things you need to know. So let's go and start with T2. So I'd mentioned with repeaters, there are repeater offsets. It'll listen on one frequency and rebroadcast on another. And in the 2-meter band, that is usually a common offset is 6 plus or minus 600 kilohertz. And there are certain frequencies which are special, which are dubbed the calling frequencies. So if you want to just talk to anyone in particular, you put out your call sign on the calling frequency for whichever band you're on. In the case of 2 meters, it's 146.52 megahertz. And in the 70 centimeter band, it's 446 megahertz. And in the 70 centimeter band, we do have UHF repeaters in that range, in which case the offset is 5 megahertz. And hopping on a repeater, I don't know if anyone's... let's see if anyone's still on this one. Yeah. I can't really get a hold of... with this antenna in here, I'll worry about that later. The way you'd call another station on a repeater, if you know that station's call sign, probably hear that. That's that tone. I've got my scanner running on some local repeater frequencies. That tone is a courtesy tone. We'll talk about that. Not sure who this is on. 44490. Let's see if we can. Here you are. I'll see if I can get them back here. And I'll try to set it up so you can hear. Calling station, I didn't have my transceiver set up, but you're getting into the repeater just fine. This is Kilo Kilo 4, Romeo Delta Delta. Nothing here. KK4 RDD clear. Alright, so I guess he just dashed in and dashed off. That's alright. I'll try to, next time I do this, I'll try to coordinate with someone to actually be on a repeater. Normally the repeater I normally use, the Bluemont repeater, has very good coverage, and there's a net right at 7 o'clock. So we might listen in on that a little bit. Let's see, where were we? Right, so basic procedure for calling someone else you know on a over a repeater. We identify with call signs, so just that station's call sign, the station you're calling, and then from your station. Responding to a CQ call, we only use CQ on AM generally, or single sideband. It's basically the same procedure. Their call sign followed by your call sign. You are allowed to make one-way transmissions only for the purpose of testing equipment, and in that case, you need to ID. So the gentleman who was calling, adjusting his station to see if his rig was working, asking for a signal report. He gave out his call sign, which I did not catch. But same rules, same identification rules apply to testing as they do to everything else. Generally, if you're spending 10 minutes continuously testing, you might want to try to fix whatever the issue is. We use the procedural signal CQ, which means calling any station. I think exactly where the abbreviation comes from. If I recall, it's something in French. And generally, we only use procedural signal. We only say CQ. You heard that. That was an APRS data burst. I'm going to turn that down there. Generally, we use CQ only on the HF bands. When you're calling on a repeater or using FM, because of part of the way that FM modulation works, you just throw out your call sign and say that you're listening on the repeater. And there is something called a band plan. Band plan is so there are the absolute rules that you must follow, which are established by the FCC. But a band plan is kind of a volunteer guideline for which frequencies should be used for which particular application. This is the 6-meter band plan. And regarding how much power you put out, under normal circumstances, it's generally you need to use the minimum amount of power necessary to carry out conversations. As a tech on FM, you are allocated up to an incredible amount of power, but generally there's no need to crank, the full 1.5 kilowatts into the air. There's a few reasons for this. It'll first of all, the more power stations use, the higher the noise floor. This is really evident on, if you've ever listened to CB radio, the noise floor is really high because of a lot of stations using illegal amplifiers. By the way, amplifiers which are capable of linears which are capable of running on the 11-meter band, which are generally branded 10-meter amplifiers, are illegal to own unless you hold an amateur radio license. And as a general guideline, when choosing an operating frequency for calling CQ, you want to listen. This applies for FM as well. You want to listen to make sure the frequency is free, so that you don't interrupt an ongoing conversation. You can ask if the frequency is in use. If we're operating in over CW in Morse code, we can use something called a Q signal, and the Q signal, Q or L, means is the frequency free or is the frequency in use. And then finally, we'd put out our CQ call over voice. We'd say CQ 3 times, followed by our call sign 3 times, just in case they didn't hear us. And if someone does hear us and cares to respond, they'll respond with your call sign, followed by their own, to start a conversation. I mentioned earlier simplex communications. Simplex is really, well, simple. That's where the term comes from. It's used to describe transmitting and receiving on the same frequency. This is basically how any FRS, any of the little bubble pack walkie-talkies, if you've ever used those, work. You have to all share a frequency. You've got to unkey the mic to be able to hear the other person. You also need to know about CTCSS or PL tones. That's really quite a mouthful of an acronym. It's a continuous tone-coded squelch system. Normally, a radio will use carrier squelch. So if I take my radio here, I've got a knob on it, which sets the carrier squelch. If I open it up, oops, if I have the right knob, then we'll hear the noise, because the noise is rather annoying to hear all the time. We'll set the squelch, and the squelch will only open and let us hear the receiver when there is a strong enough signal to open the squelch. Sometimes, however, in cases where there's interference, we can have it, instead of just opening on carrier, we can have it only play audio if it hears a certain tone, a sub-audible tone. And this is a chart of, you won't have to memorize this, don't worry about that, you just need to know what it is. These are common PL tones, private line tones, that's a Motorola term. But the proper name for it is CTCSS. We talked about carrier squelch. It's solely opening the squelch on the presence of an RF signal strong enough to break through. And CTCSS tones are most of the reasons why people can't get onto repeaters. A lot of repeaters will use a PL tone on the input in order to take care of interference. Some repeaters are a little more complex. There's a similar system called DCS, digital code squelch, which instead of using a tone, use FSK data, which is subaudible, or in a portion of the FM spectrum that doesn't get demodulated into audio. And some repeaters, a lot of closed repeaters, not all repeaters are open for use by anyone. Anyone can set up a private repeater for a club, for example. They'll use audio bursts at the beginning of a transmission to open squelch. Usually it's DTMF tones at the beginning. So in the case of modes, we talk about AM and FM. We'll go into those more depth in section T7, I believe. With amplitude modulation, with frequency modulation, the amplitude of the modulating signal determines the deviation of the FM signal. So what am I talking about? If you were to look at a spectrogram of an FM transmission, the width is the deviation. It's how far off to the right or the left or both of the center frequency that a signal occupies. And when the deviation of an FM transmitter increases, it occupies more bandwidth. And a way that you can inadvertently cause overdeviation, which can cause things like spilling over into other parts of the band. That's why you don't operate on the very edge of a band allocation, because your deviation might interfere with stations nearby, or stations on nearby frequencies, or stations in other parts of band allocations. And in the case when two amateur stations on the same frequency interfere with each other unintentionally, no one has a monopoly on a certain frequency as an amateur radio operator. You have to use common courtesy to work out moving to different frequencies and resolving the interference. In the case of repeaters, repeaters which are coordinated by volunteer coordinators, resolve interference with uncoordinated repeaters. The coordinated repeaters would have priority there. And as an encouragement to identify call signs, a lot of times the B's and C's and D's all sound similar, especially over narrowband communications. We use phonetics. These are standard ITU phonetics. You don't have to know these for the exam, but it is a good thing to know. Pretty simple to learn. I do recommend you use the actual ITU phonetics, just for the sake of standardization. We also use certain Q signals. In general, plain language is best, but we do use Q signals colloquially. For example, QSO is a conversation. There's a list of these on the next page. You need to know for the exam that QRM refers to intentional interference from other amateur stations, and QSY is the Q signal used to indicate your changing frequency. Here's a few Q signals. Q signals come from the early telegraph operators. They were the original texters of the day, using no need to send more characters than you actually absolutely have to pound out. And so Q signals are a standard way of knowing exactly what another operator is talking about. Even if they're not speaking the same language, it is possible to have a conversation over CW using just Q signals and abbreviations. QRM is, again, something is causing interference. Q signals, by the way, can be either a question or a statement, except for a few. For example, QRZ. QRZ is really only useful as a question. It means who is calling me. There's a website called QRZ.com where you can look up other operators' call signs and log them, and sort of a social network thing. QSL is an important one. QSO and QSL. QSL means I acknowledge receipt. I hear you, and we are communicating. And QSO is also used colloquially as to refer to a conversation between two amateur operators. But for the exam, you need to know QSY and QRM. QTH is one you might use quite often, refer to home location. There's a few ways to do that, which we'll discuss in a different sub-element. If you are close enough to somewhere where the station you're communicating on with can be heard without a repeater, generally you'll want to prefer that to keep the repeater free. And we talked about restricted modes in certain parts of the band. In above 50 megahertz, which is 6 meters, single sideband phone, which is a type of AM modulation. We'll talk about modes in yet another sub-element. In everything above 50 megahertz, there is always an allocation allowing for single sideband phone. Generally, at this point with VHF, UHF, FM, is more common, but single sideband is sometimes used. It's preferred for weak signal simplex operation, so you'll generally be able to communicate further on sideband than with FM. But we use FM because FM is generally immune to noise, amplitude noise specifically. And also with single sideband, the noise floor in receivers, since it's a narrow bandwidth, the noise floor is lower, so it's easier to pick out stations. So here we see the band plan compared to Part 97. Part 97 is always the rule to follow. It is the law. There is no option. So in the case of 50 mega or 2 meters actually is what we're looking at, the bottom 100 kilohertz of the band is reserved for CW only. You're only allowed to use CW in the bottom 100 megahertz. And the rest of the band you can use data or phone voice transmission, including single sideband. But usually the bottom part of it is reserved for the bottom part of all bands above 50 megahertz always has a CW portion. The band plan sets aside a portion at the bottom for a single sideband, but band plans are a voluntary affair. You don't have to follow a band plan. It is a good idea. Band plans prevent interference if they're followed and well laid out. And band plans can be different depending on where you are. So the ARRL website has good graphical band plans which can be looked at. FCC rules always apply to proper operation of your station. This section deals with emergency communications. It's pertaining to amateur radio. There's two organizations that we're worried about. RACES, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. I don't know if you can hear that. That's a repeater IDing in the background. And ARIS, Amateur Radio Emergency Service. They're both volunteer organizations which are designed to provide... you've got the Q&A app working, which are designed to provide emergency communications for the likes like FEMA and so on and so forth. But it's important to know that FCC rules don't suddenly stop applying just because FEMA wants you to do something in particular. You need to know what ARIS is. ARIS is a service which uses volunteer amateur stations, amateur frequencies, amateur allocations, etc. Often amateurs in volunteers in ARIS are certified by some sort of civil defense organization and are used to provide emergency management or civil defense communications. I'll go ahead and answer this question. What would be an acceptable use of the miscellaneous section of the band plan? The miscellaneous section, it can be anything. In that case, you see a little aside. APRS is on 144.39 megahertz. So that particular frequency is used for APRS data links. You can probably hear it occasionally on the scanner. It's a burst of data. So it can be anything. It's just a portion that's unallocated in the band plan. We see further up, there's a few simplex ranges, in 14652 included in that first simplex range. All right, let's move on. A way to get the attention, there's these things called nets. We just missed one on the Bluemont repeater. It's basically a net is a formally organized meeting, if you will, over there. There will be someone who's designated the net control operator, and they will be responsible for orchestrating the net. For people will call in and check into the net, and in the case of the Bluemont repeater, it's a traffic net, so it's used to practice passing messages. And a good way to report an emergency if there's an ongoing conversation. This doesn't necessarily just apply to nets, but any QSO in general, is to wait for a break in transmission and say either priority or emergency. I'd prefer emergency. It's simple. It conveys the issue at hand pretty well. Another way to break into a conversation is just say break several times. A lot of nets will establish whatever guideline for breaking in. Sometimes nets are organized in cases of emergencies. We have emergency nets, which are set up to pass traffic in cases where, for example, a hurricane or other sort of natural disaster has come through and disabled communications infrastructure. RACES and REs in those cases provides message passing and traffic nets for communications for the likes of the Red Cross, for example, or in some cases FEMA or federal agencies. Yes, whatever four-letter agency it is might have their own communication apparatus, but using amateur radio is a particular strength because we do this for fun, and we practice doing it as part of the hobby, and are in a lot of cases much better suited for passing traffic exactly when at a time when it counts. When checked into an emergency net, it's best generally just to check in and remain on frequency and not to transmit unless the net control station asks you to. The Bluemont repeater here is used for Skywarn, which is a network of storm chasers. Many of them do also hold amateur radio licenses, and they use the Skywarn net in the event of severe weather to report severe weather conditions. This is a radiogram form. It's a standard way for passing traffic. We'll talk about that in a different element. In the cases of emergencies, all these rules go out the window if life or property is in danger. So normally, you'd want to use amateur radio is a good fallback in case all else fails. You're allowed to use whatever at your disposal if someone's life is in danger or property is in danger, regardless of license class. Very important thing to remember. In a formal message passing, for example, that radiogram form, if you look at that again, at the top here, we have number precedence, handling instructions, station of origin, blah, blah, blah. That part, this part up here, is all called the preamble, the beginning of the message. Preamble gets sent first. And for those handling traffic, to keep the traffic system well structured, you want to keep track of these messages. There's standardized ways to handle traffic to make sure that messages get to where they need to go in a timely fashion. We use the term check. It's actually part of the radiogram preamble there, right here in the middle. A check is just a count of all the words in the message. So after the message has been passed, whoever is receiving it can check that the number of words that they wrote down, that they heard, matches the number of words that there should be. And that's just an easy way to prevent errors and make sure that we've got all of the message that we're supposed to have. And phonetics come in handy when passing traffic that might contain proper names or words with unusual spellings. And so to make sure that it gets passed properly, when passing traffic, it's recommended to use standard ITU phonetics. This is an example of there's something called the National Traffic System, which happens on a daily basis. For example, we just missed the traffic net. If I wanted to send a message to, I don't know, I could send it to Nathaniel here. I could originate traffic on my local repeater and write the message. I'd pass the traffic to whoever is willing to take it on the repeater, usually a representative from or a liaison from a sectional net or regional net. He would then take the message and pass it over HF radio to the general vicinity, used to state level, and then that would eventually trickle down until we're at least in the same area code, and then that message would either be delivered, if Nathan got his amateur radio license, he might be able to receive it directly over the air from whoever it was passed to on the local net, or it would be delivered by mailing it or a telephone call. And that's just a way to practice passing messages. It's a good skill to have for REs and races if you decide to get involved with that. ARES is open to anyone who's voluntary. It's a volunteer organization. They can volunteer their qualifications and equipment in case the need arises. Good little tip, I guess you could say, that these is in the exam. A lot of backup power for amateur stations is either a generator or a DC battery, lead acid battery. And so they're generally always 12 volts, just like a car battery. So in the case of an emergency, a radio station's backup battery can be charged with a vehicle running. Just connect the battery in parallel. Jumper cables work in this case. And that's all of T2. Do we have any questions? These questions are not updated. These are the old ones. So I really wish the Q&A app would work in the Hangout, but I guess it doesn't. And how are we on time? At 7. It's been 10 minutes shy of 2 hours, so I probably won't, unless you want me to. I can go into section T3. There's 10 sections, so however we do this, if we average 2 sections a day for an hour and a half or so, it would take 5 days. Or I could try to get through section 3. What do you think, Nathan?
I don't know. It's a lot of stuff. I think I'm kind of like radioed out actually right now. I'm like trying
Yeah,
to process all of it. It's a lot.
yeah, I am too. I'll go ahead and I'll publish these slideshows, and I'll provide the question pool. You'll want to read through it, or you can try the test one of the test generators. But it is a lot. It's 480, I think. Look, 426 questions now. They've added quite a few. It's a lot to take in, but once you've reviewed it all and taken the practiced one of the generated tests a few times confidently, it's a piece of cake. It's just 35 questions.
What was the passing rate? It was 70% for, or
You
I'm
can
sorry, passing percentage.
miss up to 11, I believe. Let me look, double check. You can miss up to. You have to score at least 26 out of 35. There it is. So, meaning you can miss 9. I think
Jeez.
it's like 74. It's really overwhelming. I mean, section T1, we're in the Hangout and the Q&A app works. That's interesting. That's weird. But see, you're not showing up in the Hangout, like, as part of the broadcast. So you might be on. I'm not sure what's going on. You have it working too? Well, I guess we're just crazy then. Can you ask a question though? Is the. There should be an ask a new. Yeah, if someone's watching on the YouTube link though, they do have the Q&A app as well. They can't see this chat here. But yeah, so yeah, section T1 and T2 to a certain extent is that was really the tough section to to cut through. It's really awful that it's the first one. Uh, let's see, pull up the. That was a lot to digest. Uh, yeah, so T3 goes into more of the physics and more of the technical side of it. We'll look at propagation. We'll look at modes. 4 goes into more of the hardware stuff. I'll show off some some hardware that'll get you on the air. Make some recommendations. And T5 and T6 is everything that I'm covering in my my Tuesday classes for electronics. Same with T9. T9 I'll be talking about not antennas specifically, but transmission lines. And T0 is also things some things I've covered in my my Tuesday electronics class. If there's not any more questions, I'll go ahead and call it a day. So I'll go ahead and in the broadcast. Thanks for joining us. If you're not completely turned off by now that we've gone through all the regulatory bureaucracy part and the nitty-gritty procedures, I'll hopefully have someone coordinated to talk to over repeater for next Thursday. I was busy throwing section T3 together. But anyways, thanks for watching. We'll be doing this again next Tuesday, or excuse me, next Thursday, for the next 4 or 5 weeks or so. See if we can't churn through it all, and hopefully get everyone prepared. So thanks for watching.